good afternoon. It's Tuesday the 23rd of January 2018, just after 1 o'clock. Welcome to UK Column News. I'm your host, Mike Robinson. Joining me in the studio again today, Patrick Henningsen from 21st Century Wire. Welcome to the programme.
Great to be with you, Mike.
Now, we're going to get straight on with Davos. Davos has opened today. This is the World Economic Forum, of course. World leaders, Theresa May will be there, quite a number of other people. Donald Trump will be there. Apparently, now that the US shutdown issue has been sorted out, we'll be talking about that in a minute. But as you can see there, these are the joint chairs of the meetings. We've got Christine Lagarde in the centre there. We've also got the Prime Minister of Norway there and a couple of others. They were giving a press conference this morning. And this is their message. Time is up for discrimination, Patrick, and abuse against women. This is from Ernest Solberg, the Prime Minister of Norway, and Christine Lagarde, head of the IMF. Christine Lagarde, of course, a perfect example, role model for women. No corruption there whatsoever, and hasn't ever been investigated for money irregularities.
No, we won't talk about the 400 million euro fraud case either, or any of the other investigations that she's managed to overcome in recent years. It's very impressive.
Now, another item on the agenda that we're going to discuss now is fake news and the censorship around the whole fake news agenda. And Patrick, one of the things that we discussed on the Sunday Wire on Sunday was this email that came out from Twitter. This one is addressed to dear Daniel McAdams. That's quite good, because I'm delighted to say we are joined today by Daniel McAdams, Executive Director from the Ron Paul Institute. Welcome to the programme, Daniel.
Hello, gentlemen. Thank you for having me.
So let's just run through this email that you received, and I believe a colleague of Patrick's received as well, from Twitter, saying, as part of our recent work to understand Russian-linked activities on Twitter during the 2016 US presidential election, we identified and suspended a number of accounts that were potentially connected to a propaganda effort by a Russian government-linked organization known as the Internet Research Agency. And it goes on to say, basically, Daniel, that you or anybody else that may have retweeted information that was allegedly pushed out by accounts linked to the Internet Research Agency, that everybody that's done that is a fool. We've been sucked into something. And therefore, Twitter is going to act in your best interests and my best interests and Patrick's best interests to make sure that we never make such foolish mistakes again in the future.
Or that we're not traumatized by touching a Russian account, even inadvertently, during the 2016 election cycle. Daniel, I was shocked to see this. This is the sort of thing that you see in sort of, I don't know, films or literature or sort of fantasy fiction. To see this happening today in the United States, coming from a corporation that's so highly, with such a high profile as Twitter, frankly, I'm speechless, Daniel.
Well, it's not only the high profile that concerns me. I mean, a private company can do what it wishes and has to suffer the consequences in the marketplace. But Twitter is in bed with government. Both Twitter and Facebook and the other social media, whenever they're called, they scamper up to Capitol Hill. They bow and scrape and say, yes, your masters, we'll do whatever you want. If Russian propaganda is a problem, we will eliminate it. So they are essentially in bed with government. And so when you get a notice like this, I think it has a very sinister edge. You can laugh at it, we can laugh it away, but I think it is rather sinister. You have been dabbling in Russia propaganda accounts, and you think, well, what's going to happen next? We already know how intimidated places like RT and Sputnik having to register as foreign agents, even though a lot of their news is better than the news we get in the US. So I find it has a very sinister edge, and it's very disturbing.
And the other thing that I was kind of surprised about on this, the timing of this, Daniel, is also coming out at the same time that this group called Hamilton 68, I'm sure you're familiar with them, led by Clint Watts and others, and these are some of the same people that seem to be connected with the Washington Post, prop or not, blacklist of internet websites, of which the Ron Paul Institute was named in this list of potential Russian propaganda partners or something like this. So it continues this kind of loose definition of what could be Russian influence, or the term they're using is Russian influence linked, which is even more wide in general than that. But so you've had experience with this sort of realm already now for over a year now.
Yeah, what is their methodology? Where is their funding coming from? Who's behind it? How do they determine the Twitter sites that they follow as suspected Russian linked, or you've put it better than I do? They will never tell you. They want transparency for everyone but themselves, which is typical of an NGO. But I think we know that people like Bill Kristol are involved. I think Michael Chertoff are involved. These are neocon ideologues, and they have no qualm about using deception as they do throughout their careers. And this has nothing to do with protecting the American people against propaganda, which in and of itself is an authoritarian idea. It has to do with silencing opposition to U.S. foreign policy. Full stop. This is what it's all about. If you oppose the neocon interventionist foreign policy, if you oppose our endless wars, if you oppose our new endless occupation in Syria, it's not because you have a different view of what America is. It's because you're being paid to do the bidding, or you're a dupe of a foreign country. And it's a very, very chilling thing in America. And sad to say, a lot of Americans are going along with it. They're very excited. It gives them something to be excited about. The Russians are infiltrating our society. It's almost as if reality has become a reality TV show.
Daniel, I'm sort of labeling this an attempt to reclaim the narrative, and there are lots of parallel strands to this, and this is another one. We were talking about Demos yesterday on this subject. Demos is one of the big British think tanks. I don't know what you would describe them as.
I would call it a sort of progressive liberal and a neoliberal sort of internationalist think tank.
Right, and so they have started this project now. It's called the Evolution of Expertise, and they say the project will investigate the causes and manifestations of declining trust and expertise in the digital age, and whether new models of trust could help to alleviate the situation or take its place. Using digital research from our pioneering Centre of the Analysis of Social Media, Demos will capture the views of thousands of British citizens to identify what drives trust and mistrust online, and how this changes by age, education, and other demographic information. We will then test the findings on social media and see how well they reflect the spread of information through media networks online. Now, so in recent days we've had research which has shown that only 1 in 6 people now trust the BBC, and in fact, when the BBC has so-called experts on, there's even more distrust of the people that they have on, who are supposed to be representing expert views. So there's clearly, to my mind, Daniel, a bit of how do we describe it? It's almost they're almost. Well, they're particularly concerned about this, and it's hard to describe how
I think feigning concern might be a better way of looking at it, but yeah.
But what are your thoughts on every direction we look? There's another program to try to understand why people are reacting in the way they are to the news media that we're getting and the rhetoric from politicians.
Well, I think two things about it that I would say. First of all, I think it actually is genuine concern. People no longer trust the mainstream media in the U.S. either. The alternative media sprang up, and people started listening to it a lot more. And so the people that are paid to give us our opinions, whether we like it or not, have been in a panic. And so they've tried to discredit independent media. They've tried to discredit alternative sources of information, and that didn't work either. So now they're taking off the gloves and they're using bare knuckles. And I think that has a lot to do with what this group and other groups are doing. The other thing that strikes me when you say this is there's got to be a lot of government money out there floating around waiting for think tanks to pick it up. We know that in the U.S., several $100 million were appropriated by U.S. Congress to fight Russian propaganda. How many millions of those have gone to places like Hamilton 68 and the German Marshall Fund, the Atlantic Council, and others to simply make things up about Russian influence? They have all the incentive in the world to make things up, really scary things, because that keeps the flow of cash coming through. And that's the problem. You have a solution. You have a problem out there that's being lavishly funded by the American taxpayer, who's being propagandized by the people who are getting money to research the problem. It's an endless loop, and it's very, very dangerous. That's the real propaganda, by the way.
Okay, and just to end off this subject, then it's coming at us in every direction, because The Hill is reporting that a man has been arrested in the United States, accused of threatening to kill CNN employees. Now, of course, Donald Trump published his fake news awards last week, and CNN, I think, had about 5 or 6 out of the 11 awards. But this is saying that a Michigan man was arrested after allegedly threatening to shoot and kill CNN employees. The FBI has launched an investigation, and it says fake news. Well, he said, "Fake news, I'm coming to gun you all down." And he said, "I'm smarter than you, more powerful than you, have more guns than you, more manpower. Your caste is about to get gunned down in a matter of hours." And so suddenly we have, this really comes back, Patrick, to the beginning of this whole fake news story, because that was David Cameron standing up in the United Nations warning us about domestic extremism and the narratives presented by domestic extremists. And here we now starting to see this as well as all the other rhetoric on this subject.
Yeah, this talking point is all too convenient in the sense that ever since Donald Trump started calling out CNN, you see this sort of reactionary talking point coming from the media saying, oh, you hear this on every single chat show from Fareed Zakaria to Chuck Todd on Sunday morning. This is so dangerous to America's fourth estate that the president is being aggressive towards the press and calling them fake news, and this is a pillar of our democracy and we must protect the fourth estate. And it's kind of a laughable approach from the media, wanting people to feel sorry for it. But this story here with CNN reported by The Hill here is going to do just that. It's going to sort of raise a sort of level of sympathy for an organization like CNN, which is probably one of the biggest producers of fake news. But Daniel, do you see in America how I hear this all the time, this talking point, isn't what Donald Trump's doing to CNN dangerous to the fourth estate? We hear this more and more.
I think what CNN is doing is more dangerous. It's attempting to propagandize Americans. But no, I think his attack on the media is probably one of the very, very few good things the president has achieved in his couple of years in the presidential race and as president. But the funny thing about this fellow, and I don't know much about the story, but whenever you see someone involved in domestic terrorism and the FBI involved, when you scratch a little bit deeper, you find out, oh, he's been known to the FBI for quite some time. These different groups that have been cultivated by the FBI, and then it provides a great narrative. Hey, we caught some bad guys. And B, the sub-narrative, which is extremely important, is, oh, you can't criticize the mainstream media. See, it's only extremists, only lunatics like this guy with the gun who criticize the mainstream media. So I don't want to sound like a conspiracy theorist, but it smells a little bit fishy to me.
I agree, actually.
Yeah. Well, look, just to end this section, Daniel, I mean, where do you see this ending? How do you see this progressing as the year goes on?
Well, I don't see anything good happening. I don't see a lot of pushback from people, and I think that the move against RT and Sputnik, whatever you think about their coverage, the idea that they shouldn't be allowed to broadcast or that they should be intimidated is a dangerous sign. I think the next move will be to go after people who work there, to go after people who appear on these channels, and then once you have established the narrative that it's actually Russian bots that are controlling all of us poor people who don't want us to bomb every country overseas that doesn't do what we say. We're actually controlled, we're dupes controlled by foreign governments. Well, then, of course, you have to clear that. We've seen this movie before. It's called the Soviet Union. The reason you didn't meet your 5-year plan is not because the 5-year plan was stupid. It's because wreckers have moved in and destroyed things. So we've seen the narrative before. This is not going to end well unless America wakes up and realizes they're being played. Bad things are going to happen.
Okay, well, moving on then, back to Davos, and well, as I say, many world leaders are going to be there over the coming few days, and the first to speak was Narendra Modi, from India, and he has pledged to make India a $5 trillion economy by 2025. He said that the world has moved from a needs-based to a greed-based consumption economy. He said the world is threatened by the rising attacks on globalization, and therefore we must continue to support the rules-based international order. He said the world economy must be more inclusive, reforming major institutions of the world connected to politics, to the economy, security. And he talked about Indian soldiers who died in world wars in the 20th century to help create peace and humanity. India can be a humanizing and a harmonizing force, he said, in an uncertain world. And he said that together we can create a heaven of future, but on the basis of supporting the rules-based international order. Now, he was talking about the growing gaps in wealth distribution. And in parallel with that today, Oxfam has produced this report, Reward Work, Not Wealth. And they are saying that billionaires have seen their wealth increase by $762 billion in the last 12 months. They say the huge increase could have ended global extreme poverty several times over. 82% of all wealth is created in the last year went to the top 1%, while the bottom 50% saw no increase at all. So this is a continuing problem, and we're not seeing this issue addressed through policy at the moment, Pat.
Sure, and Daniel, how do you view this issue? Obviously, this is a reoccurring theme. We see at all these sort of global summits, and Davos being kind of the most, I would say, neoliberal gathering traditionally every year. But I know the Ron Paul Institute works on this particular issue, focuses on it quite a lot.
Yeah, it's the masters of the universe gathering to tell the rest of us why we're so evil, and why we shouldn't demand things. No, I've taken a very skeptical view, as I know both of you have, about the Davos and about all of these gatherings of the elites, because it's simply not a matter of, I mean, if you want to open up the impoverished parts of the world to success, I think you have to get people out of the way who want to tinker from above. The rules-based order, I mean, I hate to say this, the biggest violator of the rules-based order right now is the United States of America. We have troops in Syria. They're illegal. We are bombing people. We don't follow the Constitution. So it really is an exercise in hypocrisy and in navel gazing, but it is quite dangerous as well.
Yep. Okay. Well, another subject being discussed at Davos is the issue of cyber and cybersecurity. This is Rob Wainwright here from Europol. He's soon to step down from Europol. He's talking about where he's leading a panel discussing how public and private sector organizations should be sharing much more data in order to keep us much more safe and secure. But Patrick, The Guardian highlighting this issue with an article entitled "Major Cyber Attack on the UK, a matter of when, not if." Yeah,
they're strictly transposing the terrorism narrative here with cyber now. So it's not a question of when, it's a question of if. And so, this is the sort of normal sort of fear-mongering. You can see now The Guardian is running point on this particular issue. But this is an easy sort of gravy train in terms of cyber. And Daniel, in the United States, in Europe, especially with the Russian threat being ramped up in the media and in politics, the area of cyber is a massive gravy train in terms of contracts and funding. And I think, like what you illustrated before, Daniel, with the fake news epidemic and so many people hoping to capitalize on this, cybersecurity is by orders of magnitude even bigger. Go ahead.
No, I think, Patrick, you used the absolute correct term, gravy train, and that's exactly what it is. These people follow the money. If you go to Washington, D.C., especially in the outskirts, you'll find that people live very well. They're the most wealthy counties in the United States. So there's a lot of money in this. I remember when I was on Capitol Hill right after 9/11, all of a sudden out of nowhere sprang up these new magazines, well-funded magazines, glossy magazines about homeland security and cybersecurity. And there were all sorts of conferences, and Mike Chertoff and all these masters of the universe were appearing at these conferences. The place is so awash in our money, in the middle class, the working class Americans' money. It is so awash in it. You terrify Americans, you steal their money, and then you propagandize them about how dangerous it is so you can steal more money. And I don't want to sound cynical, but I've seen it for a number of years, and it is very, very disturbing.
Well, I mean, that's exactly the same, mirrors exactly what goes on in Europe, because, of course, NATO based in Brussels, EU based in Brussels, and between them at various European Defence Agency conferences for the last 2 or 3 years, NATO conferences as well. Cybersecurity, absolutely the top of the agenda, is being presented as another fair strategy to bring in some cash.
And it's endless amount of firewalls that you can build in this virtual world that you can justify by whatever the threat that you sort of illustrated as. So it is a bottomless pit in terms of money.
Yeah.
The other issue, if I just to finish on that, if I could have a second, is the nuclear posture review that President Trump will be releasing next month talks about the first use of a nuclear weapon if the U.S. is a victim of a cyber attack.
Wow.
So that really brings it into the realm of something even more sinister, I think.
Absolutely.
That is disturbing. The normalization, we'll talk about that on a future program, but this new normalization of nuclear weapons, I never thought I would see it in my lifetime, people talking about nuclear weapons as if they're sort of a possibility that should be put into the stratagem. We're hearing this more and more, this normalization.
Yeah, absolutely. It's not something which is never to be used anymore. It seems to be more something which is actually in our arsenal to be used.
Yeah, an option to retaliate against a cyber attack. Unbelievable.
But to end off with Davos then, Patrick, I think this is 2013 when you published this article?
This was 2014, and I wrote this at the time, and I was just kind of having a kind of stream of conscious rant about Davos at the time, but I really pointed out then that the most disturbing aspect of Davos is it's become kind of like another Bilderberg meeting. In other words, this sort of an unofficial off-campus, off-the-books sort of thing, and it's a little, I'll quote, a little disturbing how Davos, like Bilderberg, has become a venue for deals done by public and political officials completely outside of the democratic process. And lots of one-on-one meetings in hotel rooms, we're told, and that's all okay in the Davos bubble. And my concern is with Davos, and I'll throw this back to our guest, Daniel McAdams, is that these are public officials. These are people working in governments who are meeting outside of government, making deals, having one-on-one meetings, colluding with corporations. This is the new normal, I think, going forward, Daniel.
And they're in lavish surroundings. They feel themselves to be much more important than they actually are, because as you point out, they should be answering to the rest of us who vote or do not vote for them. So they get put into a bubble, as you say. They're in lavish surroundings. They're meeting with very, very wealthy people, and they feel themselves to be masters of the universe. And so they're certainly very willing to make deals behind the scenes. And I think it is very dangerous. It's anti-democratic. It's certainly revolting to see these elected officials cavorting with billionaires and making rules for the rest of us poor working folks.
It's the only place you can see Nikki Haley rubbing elbows with Bono. And it's a great opportunity for a lot.
Could have gone all morning without hearing her name.
But I don't know if she's actually there this year, but anyway.
Trump will be there on Friday. He was to be there on Friday, and then he wasn't to be there because of the close down in the States. But just before we come on to the close down, Patrick, this was Reuters reiterating what we said on the program yesterday, worried about the snow burying the venue and will people get there. And they said that when Trump comes on Friday, it's far from obvious whether he'll be able to use a fleet of large helicopters to land at Davos. Large helicopters increase the risk of avalanches. And
I say bring on the helicopters and do a few laps, just to be safe.
But anyway, the reason that Trump may not have been there on Friday, I believe he now will be, was because, of course, the budget was not approved.
Yes. And this was probably in terms of U.S. domestic politics, this is the biggest story of the week, is the government shutdown. But as I pointed out early on the week on RT, this has become a sort of a 6-month routine. Every 6 months, threats or talks of defunding the government or a government shutdown. And I think a last-minute deal has been made to sort of extend funding for a period of time with regards to the shutdown, but it's turned into a kind of partisan slugging match. It's even more partisan before, I think. Now that there's a Republican president in the White House, but what does it amount to at the end of the day? The U.S. is technically bankrupt on paper anyway, so this government shutdown is really part and parcel of the process now in America. Daniel, how are you looking at this issue?
Well, I think it's more farcical than partisan. The partisan issue, it's a term that's used, but on the real big issues, and this is a weekly column from Dr. Paul points this out, the two parties agree essentially on everything. They agree on the warfare state, the welfare state. They agree on endless spending. They agree that deficits don't matter. They agree that the Federal Reserve should continue propping up big corporations at the expense of the rest of us. They agree on the big things, but they love to bicker about the inconsequential things, the small things, the things that try to delineate themselves from each other, where in fact it's a complete farce. When I first went to Capitol Hill in the early 2000s, we actually did an amazing thing called the appropriations process, where the different committees got together and they hashed out how they were going to fund government. By the time I left in 2012, that was all completely gone. It was the chairman, it was the speakers that they got together in back rooms. There was no more hashing of things out. The representatives are totally inconsequential. They don't matter. The power is all concentrated in the leadership. These things are all foregone conclusions. And the whole idea of a shutdown is a farce. And one of the best examples is the first thing you see when there is a shutdown is anything that an American who pays taxes may actually want to use. That'll have a big sign on it saying, this is shut down. You can't walk into this park. You can't park in this parking lot because of the shutdown. It's a complete joke.
Okay. Well, look, I think we'll end that section of news there. Daniel, thank you very much for joining us today. It's been a real pleasure. I hope we can have you on again at some other time. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Daniel.
Thank you.
Okay, Patrick, let's move on then to UK and defence. Well, Russia is the biggest threat to the UK since the Cold War, says British Army Chief.
Yes. Well, this again, The Guardian, running point on the warmongering here. So what was shocking to me about the coverage by The Guardian on this is you have people giving commentary on this. They're not challenging what he's saying at all, which is normally what the press or what the media are meant to do. But in this case, nothing at all. So almost like kind of playing softball along with this completely outrageous rhetoric coming here from General Sir Nick Clark. So, Carter. So, look at the background of this image, Mike. Where is this event taking place?
Well, that's right, because what is actually going on here? Well, of course he is. And the question is it ever justifiable to use this type of rhetoric in order to call for more funding for the military? We have been calling at the UK column for more funding for the military because it's been defunded for reasons we've discussed involving EU military unification and so on. But he is using this rhetoric to call for more funding for the military. This is coming from Russia.
Look at this image.
And look at this image.
A Russian long-range bomber in the background there. So, but nothing about Russia in the headline. So this is subliminal advertising by the Royal Services Institute. Dare I say, this is propaganda coming from Russia.
So this is Ewan Lawson, and it's about defence spending. It's entitled "Thinking About Home: The National Security Capabilities Review and the UK Defence." And he says the new National Security Capabilities Review might engage the public in thinking about its role in protecting the UK, in contrast to perceiving the military as primarily for going far away to fight foreign wars. Announced in the summer of 2017, the UK government's review, led by the National Security Advisor Mark Sedwill, will supposedly examine the policy and plans across government to deliver a national security strategy and ensure that investment necessary for capabilities is efficient and effective. The review includes 13 strands, but it is the defence strand that has received the most media attention. In part, this reflects the very real challenge of managing the defence budget, which, while the details are disputed, remains unaffordable. Well, of course, it doesn't remain unaffordable at all. And it's very hard, Patrick, to sort of pull together the various strands of this argument because we are required to spend 2% of GDP on defence in order to be part of NATO, according to NATO and Donald Trump. We are the biggest funder of the European Defence Agency and the European Defence Fund, and at the end of the day, government is making decisions about where it spends its money, but a shortage of money is not the reason for the lack of defence funding. As we've said many times before, the reason for a lack of defence funding is in order to to normalise Britain's defence capability with the rest of Europe for integration purposes.
Sure, it's the concept of interoperability, which you've talked about many times in this program. So in other words, paring down the British Royal Air Force or building up the Navy. So Britain has certain jobs that it will fulfill in an integrated European collective defense structure. So, but what the biggest thing is, Britain, the UK is, for all intents and purposes, is not under threat of invasion from any country or attack from Russia. It's just not going to happen. So what are they really talking about? What is Nick Carter talking about? What is he doing other than lobbying to the lucrative defense contracting industry? And by doing that, by all of these people doing this, politicians as well will guarantee themselves jobs on the board of the Carlyle Group, positions, CEO positions at Raytheon, at Boeing, or whatever the company is, BAE Systems. So this is part of the sort of overall military-industrial bandwagon that has become so fashionable to be able to jump through the revolving doors of politics or the military into corporate life and to net some great fortunes in the process. And to do that, you need to ramp up an existential threat. And right now, today, yesterday it was ISIS, today it's Russia.
Well, the Los Angeles Times headline saying that U.S. national obsession with Russia is preventing sane debate. Well, that headline actually could equally apply to the United Kingdom as well. It is a national obsession. It has become a national obsession. It's being driven by Theresa May, the likes of Matthew Rycroft as well, while he was UN Security Council permanent representative. This is something which has now entered the daily mainstream media narrative, and hugely dangerous, and hugely unwarranted.
Well, what's interesting about this article in the LA Times is a real liberal bastion, obviously in California, progressive liberal central there. So, but this is one of the first times you'll see a mainstream media outlet giving at least the headline of saying that this is a national obsession with Russia. If you read down through the article, they go through the normal canards like Russia hacked the 2016 election, so they're not willing to let go of some of those talking points. But in terms of that story, we've been saying what an unhealthy obsession this is for now over a year, or years in fact. So you see, as the UK column or 21st Century Wire or some of the alternative media outlets are well ahead of the curve, and the mainstream talking points eventually come to validate what we've said 2 years ago or 3 years ago. Although it takes them a year or two before they're done propagandizing, they sort of admit reality. The same is true with the BBC's coverage of Syria. Here's a report by Elisa Doucette. She's talking about the rebuilding of Aleppo. It's all a good, nice, trendy story in the mainstream media. But where were they a year ago, Mike? Where were they a year and a half ago with regards to really talking about the reality of what's going on in Aleppo in terms of, in fact, that picture they have right there, we did a report from that very spot back in April, right there in the BBC's thing. But so, she's being a bit conciliatory towards the government after BBC and other Western media outlets have been slamming the Syrian government, calling them brutal dictators and genocidal maniacs and so forth. And here now, you read that article by the BBC, it doesn't exactly represent what we've reported. It's a little bit short, but generally it reflects the tone that we established years ago. So in both cases, the two biggest stories in the world, Russia and Syria, alternative media, UK column, 21st Century Wire, other outlets, were way ahead. And now the media, the BBCs of the world, the LA Times of the world, forced to confront the reality. In other words, the real story. Because the propaganda operation, which they've been running for the last 3 or 4 years, has failed miserably. They have failed in toppling the government in Syria, and believe me, the BBC was on board with that project, as is The Guardian, as are the Times, as are Channel 4 and many other mainstream media outlets, and CNN, completely hell for leather for regime change in Syria, and now reality hits, and they're changing their tact. Well, guess what? We were way ahead of them, Mike. So it's just proof of that, once again.
Now, we were talking about Afrin yesterday, and there's been some dialogue between Jim Mattis and Erdogan overnight?
Yes, there is. So Erdogan basically was chastising the United States. The United States was criticizing Mattis and others, criticizing Turkey's incursion into Afrin in northern Syria, as many people have, and rightly so. And Erdogan quipped back saying, well, how long will you be in Iraq and Afghanistan, speaking to the U.S.? And so my point on this is entertaining backwards and forwards, but at the end of the day, we have a real serious situation here. I think if Turkey was to really hit the United States between the eyes, they would have said to the United States, well, what are you doing in Syria? But obviously, Turkey can't say that to the U.S. because they're in Syria illegally as well by international law. And also pointed out there's some parallels, at least physically and strategically, between what Turkey is attempting to do here in northern Syria. In other words, hold a piece of land as a security buffer zone, potentially for a long period of time. We don't know how long this is going to last. Is it going to be months? Is it going to be years? In the case of Israel, managed to do this, take advantage of the war in Lebanon in the 1980s in order to hold a piece of South Lebanon as a security buffer zone for over 15 years. It ended badly in the end for Israel, but they used the same exact justification that South Lebanese militia, Hezbollah, were terrorists when they weren't. In this case, Turkey is accusing the Kurdish militias in Afrin of being YPG terrorists and so forth, and that's justifying their incursion, attack, and potentially an occupation. We don't know yet. Let's hope not.
Yesterday, Mahmoud Abbas, who's head of the Palestinian Authority, was in the EU. Of course, he was meeting EU Foreign Minister, however she describes herself, that's what she is, Federica Mogherini. And he was asking the EU to swiftly recognize Palestine, the state of Palestine, with East Jerusalem as its capital. He was there the same day that Mike Pence was in Israel, speaking to the Knesset. And he was saying to the Knesset that the US was going to move its Israel from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem by the end of 2019. But the question is whether the EU is going to recognize Palestine as a state and recognize East Jerusalem as its capital. The recognition of Palestine wasn't going to disrupt the resumption of negotiations, is what he said. And he said it would encourage the Palestinian people to keep hoping for peace and wait until peace is brought about. And he said that the Europeans had agreed with them about the issue of Jerusalem. They understand it, but they have not made a decision about the recognition yet because it needs another meeting. What's your thoughts on this?
Well, what's significant if you bring back that picture? To me, this is a stalemate. That's going to be a stalemate for a long period of time. Not good, obviously, for the Palestinians. This is okay for Israel because they're quite happy to go along with this sort of apartheid setup. But what's important here, Mike, is look who's opposite of Mahmoud Abbas.
Yeah.
That is Federica Mogherini, a high representative of the European Commission. And so she is flexing her muscles, or in fact the EU is flexing its muscle in terms of international diplomacy. And so the big critique is that Europe doesn't have a security strategy, even though they've published them over the years. But this is one indication of what needs to be done for Europe to be a player internationally, perhaps moving closer to the UN Security Council, at least symbolically, but playing a major role in major international affairs, like the Iran nuclear deal, like the Palestinian question as well. And so, like it or not, this is exactly what the EU is doing, Mike, is asserting itself and successfully, I might add, in a couple of occasions in terms of rebuffing Trump's threat to submarine the Iran nuclear deal, and also challenging Netanyahu a couple of months ago, which Mogherini did, and that was just unthinkable that anybody from Brussels could do something like that a couple of years ago. So people need to take notice of Brussels is asserting itself.
Yes, exactly. Today is the Economic and Financial Affairs Council. Well, who is at that? Well, various finance ministers from the country, from various member states are there, of course. They're discussing further development of economic and monetary union, amongst other things. But Philip Hammond was there on his way to Davos So let's have a quick look at what he said.
I'm here today to carry on our discussions about international tax and many other important issues. We're still full members of the European Union, and we're going to carry on taking a full part in all the discussions. And of course, I will take the opportunity to meet with colleagues to build on the momentum that we generated in December with the agreement on the completion of Phase 1 discussions and the process to begin Phase 2 discussions about Brexit.
You'll be travelling down to Davos. Does that continue down there? Discussions in terms of future relations, trade deals and so on?
Yes, of course, there'll be lots of people at Davos, and the message we'll be taking is that Britain's open for business. We're keen to discuss with partners, both European and further afield, about our future relationships and Britain's role in the global economy, and in particular, London's role in the global financial economy.
So he began by talking about international tax. That is indeed on the agenda. The European Union this morning lifted 8 countries, amongst them South Korea, Panama, UAE, Tunisia, Mongolia, Macau, Grenada, Barbados, removed from the blacklist of countries that engage in dodgy tax procedures, practices. So they have now been brought back into the fold, as it were. These countries apparently have sorted out their offshore tax governance problems following publication of the Panama Papers. And so 9 jurisdictions remain on the blacklist. That's American Samoa, Bahrain, Guam, Marshall Islands, Namibia, Palau, St. Lucia, Samoa, Trinidad and Tobago. So those are the countries that are still on the blacklist. But Patrick, it is what we said. This is the continuing moves to establish global rules on tax, bringing tax into the rules-based international order and centrally managed.
Not only that, but levying global tax as well. That's something that is not out of the imagination of this conversation. I think an international tax for an international fund, we're not sure exactly what that fund would be used to administer, but I see this framework, Mike, as a prelude to some sort of international tax obligation.
And again, it is going to be the EU that drives that, Patrick, because on the agenda here again was the business of economic monetary union. We know that banking union is well down the road at the moment. Treasury and a tax system, this is coming. And
the EU is unique, Mike, in its ability to enforce governance, because it doesn't do it through a carrot and stick approach. It does it through a carrot approach, which is access to the European Union, which is the largest, most lucrative common market in the world right now. So that's an amazing carrot to be dangling there. In return, they want good governance from affiliates and partners, not just for future member states, Mike, but for anybody that wants to do business or to get into the common market. So this is how they're able to spread governance or to normalize procedures across streamlined procedures internationally with what Europe is doing. So this is like the Borg in Star Trek. Basically, you either, what was that saying in Star Trek? They either
we're going to assimilate everybody.
Assimilate or die and die off in some corner of the galaxy. So it is a powerful system, Mike. And it's something that a lot of people need to sort of come to grips with if they want to understand exactly what's going on in the headlines right now. And
we'll just end with, very briefly, the last headline from Sydney Morning Herald here. Perfect storm, global financial system showing danger signs, says senior OECD economist. I have to say, it's been showing danger signs since 2008, but more and more people talking about it. And when it goes this time, nobody is going to be able to say that nobody saw this coming.
And you see these warnings every few months, every year. It's almost like we've become used to seeing headlines like this, but this report, I think, is really interesting because it does point out that there's been a number of emergency measures in terms of credit, and also points out that a lot of big corporations have been quietly accessing really obscure, cheap credit markets. The Carillion story, Mike, is an example of this, and there's many, many others. That's only the tip of the iceberg. So the size of this bubble is unknown at the moment, mainly because the press are not interested yet in it and covering it. But they've pointed out a number of signs, the OECD head there, of matching exactly the signs leading up to the Lehman Brothers crash in 2008. So there is a kind of a forensic reality case to be made there, that what we are looking at are identical conditions right now in 2018, 10 years after, right preceding the Lehman Brothers crash. So
there's a major difference this time round, though, and that is this: in 2007, 2008, the financial crash was affecting financial organizations, big banks, and so on, and the idea of too big to fail. This time, as we mentioned last week when we were talking about Carillion, what we're seeing is the rise of the zombie company. And these are corporations in the real economy, corporations providing real products, real services, which are carrying levels of debt to the point where their annual income is not sufficient to meet their debt obligations. This means that when this one goes, this isn't just going to be national governments and international agreements to try to save the banking industry. This is going to take a large part of the productive economy with it, and this makes it much more dangerous.
And there's going to be calls for bailouts, and the government will be asked, the British government, the US government, Brussels, France, Germany will be asked to bail out these corporations.
Yeah, but they don't have anything to bail them out with. So this is where we're at. Okay, we'll end there. Thank you very much, Patrick, for joining us. Thank you very much to Daniel McAdams for joining us the first half of the programme. Thank you for joining us as well, and we will be back at the usual time, 1 p.m. tomorrow. We'll see you then. Bye-bye.